Hello, everyone, and welcome to Real Politic. I'm Sandy Plunkett,
And I'm Joanne Gray.
and we are really delighted to have DroneShield's CEO, Oleg Vornik, with us today to have a great conversation because DroneShield, a counter drone technology company, the only publicly listed counter drone technology company, has been on a bit of a run on the back of not just a rising share price, but also some really significant contracts, the $60 million contract in Europe and picking up other US defense contracts, building out your product pipeline, a couple of internal promotions, CTO and Chief Product Officer, which is really good because it's all about positioning Drone Shield for the next phase of growth and global expansion. So we appreciate that you've got a lot going on. So to spend a little bit of time with us today is really great. So you've been at the helm of Drone Shield for a decade or more, right? How are you handling your overnight success?
Thanks, Sandy and Joe, and appreciate you guys having me on the program. It's been a great journey. So in the first few years, we literally lived hand to mouth. We listed really early in 2016, about a year or two into our life as a company, and we at the time were micro cap, so we listed on about 25 million market cap, raised $7 million. And for the first maybe even 5 or 6 years, it was maybe raising $1 or $2 million at a time, always being 3 months away from running out of cash. And the counter drone industry really didn't exist at the time. Everybody thought that small drones is just kids' toys. So why would you have protection against what you buy children for Christmas? So yeah, it's been really tough because you basically 3-6 months of cash flow at best at any given point in time, and you just continue to push and hope that eventually the market will catch up and the customers will see the demand for the equipment. But what the time really gave us is ability to fine tune the technology, build out the team, and so when customers started showing interest in our products, we're there. And in defense, it's very much a first mover advantage. If you're there capturing the customer engagement, then they really become embedded with you and they start giving you their thoughts and the information. And like, for example, tomorrow, if Sandy, you and I would decide to create the next tank and we'll turn up to the US Army and say, hey, we want to build a better tank. They'll be like, no, we already got our tank. We don't want another tank.
I don't think that's in my calendar, but I'll fix that.
So similarly for counter drone, once you embed yourself, the militaries, unless you really screw up, they prefer to actually continue dealing with you. And DroneShield became that first mover, and obviously ongoing, we invest quite a lot in R&D and software and hardware development.
Interesting, because even though you were way ahead of the market, not just counter drone, but drones, right? And a testament to your leadership, I think, Oleg, is that you clearly just sort of said, okay, right, we're going to use this time to really get the R&D and the product market fit right, and building the relationships clearly that you needed for sales contracts. Did it take longer than you thought?
It's hard to say. I mean, I don't know if I'd do it again if I knew everything I know now. I think so a lot of our senior team has been around since very early days, right? So Angus Bean, who's our chief product officer, only been around for maybe 6 months longer than me, so 6 months shorter than me. Sorry. So
Okay.
he's essentially our employee number 2, with me being employee number 1. And as I often talk with Angus, we sometimes think, geez, like in the early years, I think we just thought that, well, we'll give it our best, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. I don't think we ever thought this is going to become as big as it is, and we just sort of rolled with it. It's like, okay, well, we survive another day. Great, we'll just keep pushing. So you kind of just go and I think running a business like that is a bit like you're running a marathon, except you don't really know where the end is. You just kind of keep going and hope for the best.
So, Oleg, could you tell us a little bit about the building that team? Because it must have been a little bit rocky at the start, with the founders and the original developers of the tech and listing on the Australian market, which at that time was seen as some sort of pathway to liquidity and to the US market. So tell us a little bit about building up the team and how that happened.
So the company started by 2 US scientists, John Franklin and Brian Kearing, having an idea that you want to develop acoustics-based drone detectors. And the reason why acoustics is because it's actually technically easiest, it's least export control constraint, it's the cheapest. You're basically having a sensitive microphone with a bit of a process at the back end to separate the sound of drone buzzing noise from cicadas or jackhammers or something else. And so when they got funding from a New York-based fund, which is what they were asking, the condition was one, ASX listing as means of essentially eventual liquidity out for the fund, and also as means for the company to raise money. And second, for me to come on board, as they needed somebody commercial to run the business. I was a banker with Royal Bank of Canada in Sydney in the industrials M&A team, and I was kind of over my 10 years in banking, and so I jumped on board to do
And
the
as CFO, right?
as CFO. Yeah, so the company needed a person who was experienced in being on a C-suite of a listed business. So they picked a guy who was previously as a CFO of an AIM, so secondary London Exchange, of an AIM
Yeah,
listed company.
yeah,
So he was a CEO through the listing, and I was the CFO. And then about 6 months in, the board basically decided that he
yeah,
wasn't really up to scratch, so they
yeah,
replaced him with me. And this was the end of 2016 or early 17. And I sort of
yeah,
ran from there.
yeah.
So the thing about, I think, early stages of any business, it tends to be a bit more volatile, and you have particular types of personalities that I think get attracted to very early stage businesses. And as you become kind of more uniform as a company, a lot of those wrinkles tend to get ironed out. So the two original founders, as the company grew, they just didn't really fit with the rest of the business. So they parted ways in the first 2 years of the company, and we basically started hiring more and more engineers. The technology changed entirely. So I'd say the
Uh-huh.
only real overlap from when we listed to what we're now is probably the company's mission being counter drone and the name and the
Okay,
logo, but the tech is entire. I mean, tech is now about radio frequency, integration of sensors, hardware, software. So we don't even do acoustics at all. We
right.
integrate third-party acoustics. In fact, we completely moved away from it because what we offer now is just so much more superior for counter drone. And over time, you find that some people grow with the business, and some people do not. Like some of the early employees we hired, they were great in the company of 5 people, 10 people, 20 people, but just didn't really function well in a company of 50 or 100. And then some others, like for example, I mentioned Angus Bean before, they scaled really
Yeah,
well. So
yeah.
they were great in the company of 5, but also great in the company of 300, 400. And I think it's just a personal growth kind of equation, because there's this organizational theory that basically says that the company gets completely broken down and remade at certain points, like
Yeah,
30, 50, 100, 300 people, in terms of how you do your internal communications, your processes,
yeah.
your strategy, really. And so we've been going through all those phases.
You were in investment banking or in M&A, and you weren't really loving it, right? Did you know you wanted to get your hands into running and growing a company at that stage, or were you just sort of saying to yourself, "There's got to be something more than investment banking or M&A"?
Well, we say when I interview people to come to DroneShield, what I say to any job applicant who has the bad fortune of getting me to be on the interviewing side is that there's a push and a pull in every job change. So there's something you dislike about your
Yeah.
current job, and there's something
Um,
you're attracted to about the job that you're talking to. So for me, there was a strong push in that. I did about 10 years in investment banking. I remember I had one little anecdote. So I was in a cab home at 11 p.m. and my boss at the time calls me and he's like, "Oh, where are you?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm in a cab home." He's like, "Well, why you go home?" And I'm like, "Well, because I've done everything we discussed." He's like, "Well, isn't there something else you could be doing? You don't go home at 11 just because
Wow.
you finish your things that you had." And I was like, at that point, I was thinking, there's something wrong with this. Either I'm not getting it or he's not getting it, but it's not really working out for me. Uh, and so there's also the kind of work you do itself, right? So I think
Yeah.
most people in banking are not really there because they love it. In M&A, they're there for money, they're there maybe for their perception of prestige, but they're not really there for work itself, because ultimately you're there as an aid to somebody else to make their decisions, right?
Right.
Um, and so I was done with the hours. I was done with the kind of just the nature of work where I just wasn't really connecting with, finding typos in pitch books, that kind of thing. So so I was looking for something else. Now, why Drone Shield? Did I have the grand vision about counter drone in 10 years? No, I mean, I could see it as a really interesting idea. I mean, it's clear it was a much more interesting business than, I don't know, being in the fertilizer business or something. But I think the bit that attracted me the most is, I think most people come to work first and foremost for people, as opposed to for platforms, companies, products. And so I knew the fund, which basically connected me with the two other guys really well, and I really
That's
respected them.
Bergman. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And I knew that even after dilution, after the IPO, there would be a meaningful shareholder for a period of time. And I really cherished the idea of working with somebody like that. I really trusted them. I felt I could learn a lot from them. So ultimately, it was that as a first and foremost that drew me into it. And then I mean, I guess you eventually become fully, a bit like, a child growing up, you become fully separated. They're sold out. And also Peter James, who's our chair, who came in during the IPO. So we developed a really great relationship, that kind of an older statesman. So Peter had been around first as a tech CEO for a lot of his career in Australia, and then professional chair. And I think the problem that a lot of chairs have is they almost compete with the CEO for kind of almost being an armchair CEO. But Peter already done all of that. I think when we started working together, he was already 65, so he was ready to be in a true chair role, not as opposed to being essentially a competitor to a CEO position. So being there to support me when I needed it, at the same time stepping back when I wanted to do my own thing. So we have this really good trusting relationship, which really helped.
But how did you find each other, by the way?
Bergen connected us. So they knew him, I believe, through some connections through Neomap, as he was already on the board of Neomap, and they made the connection.
Okay. Okay.
So I'm curious about this development and the turnover of your team when you had to turn the team over twice. You were in the US, you'd moved to Virginia to really embed yourself in the whole sort of defense procurement scene and get to know people. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that sort of quite rough process, I suppose, again, of trying to find the right team and the right people for the moment.
So we always had two teams, one in Sydney, which is our headquarters, which is still where I am, and also in the US and in Virginia, like you said, Joe. So our Sydney team has been also a bit more volatile in the beginning, but we never went through kind of the whole, scratch and start everything again like we did twice in the US, like you said. So I think the issue in the US was that problem with being a banker is that you're very good at hiring other bankers who are sort of like mini-me's. They're sort of what you were maybe 5-10 years ago, and you know what to look for, what makes a good one. But say if you're a banker and now you're like, okay, I'm going to hire a person who's an expert in sales to US military. It's like, where do you even start? And the problem with Americans, yeah, and that's a compliment, is that they are extremely good at self-promotion. They're extremely confident, and they kind of bamboozle you with all these terms, and you kind of like, okay, you kind of look like you know what you're doing. I mean, you know more than I do, and good enough. And then you kind of realize quickly enough that if somebody can like know a bit more than you do, it doesn't mean that they are, good for the job. And so yeah, we twice, and the same thing for hiring engineers, by the way. Like, I mean, now we're thankfully in a position where all the teams are established, so people doing hiring are actually technically competent to assess the candidates. Back then, it's like, what does Oleg know about hiring software engineers? Like zero. So that took me a little while. The other thing I've made a mistake doing was I was trying to build almost competing, or call it maybe complementary R&D teams, both in the US and Australia at the time. And I just found that just couldn't do it. The two teams didn't like each other. They were just naturally doing everything from scratch themselves. And in the US, you're competing with all the shiny companies like, not just Lockheed, but SpaceX and Tesla and Amazon. So the talent is very expensive, very hard to find. And honestly, Virginia is not a great place for it. So Virginia was a great, and is still a great office location because you are very close to your customer base. So good
Yeah.
kind of sales office.
Yes, but what you're saying is it's not Silicon Valley.
Yeah, exactly. And so as a result, we never really had access to best US engineers. But Sydney is good for it, right? Like we have obviously big ecosystem. Australia is well known for lots of tech companies, hardware and software. And so building engineering teams in Australia was always just much easier. So over time, I said, right, we're going to scratch the idea of doing any meaningful R&D in the US, and sales, we just kind of kept trying again and again until 7 years ago, we got the current sales team on board, and they really propelled the company forward. And now I think there's going to be a second wind coming in the US as people think of us as a defense sales company, which is kind of what most of our revenues are. But I think there's now a wave coming for sales to data centers, airports, critical infrastructure like oil and gas facilities, against drone infiltrations there. And I think this would be a whole new culture. Like you now have more enterprise salespeople, which is very different mentality to salespeople who are selling to defense. So I'm actually really excited about that.
We want to get into that because that is a significant shift, and it does seem to be very much a part of the future, especially if for some reason there is a outbreak of peace. Trump may engineer in some way, given what he's trying to do with China. But I also want to just touch on building an R&D team in Australia. It does make sense, but it's also what you've been able to achieve, which I know, having worked in tech in Australia and outside of tech, that often Australia's undoing is we've got the R&D and we've got really good skills, sort of broad, not necessarily deep. But what we don't really have is a product focus and a commercial focus, right? I'm really interested in what that dynamic was like in your mind and with your team, and how that has evolved over time. Because I often hear from other serial tech founders that you never see a job offer in Australia for like a sophisticated product development guy or girl, right? Because we just don't think in terms of product and company building. Would you agree that that Australia sort of lacks a product and company building focus when it comes to tech?
100%. So it's interesting, when we first done the role split that we talked about at the start of this conversation. So instead of just CTO, have also a CPO, Chief
Right.
Product Officer. This was actually learning evolution for me as well. I'm like, well, what's the difference? And I think a lot of people have no idea, what does a product officer actually do? And a chief product officer in a tech company, and this is really a hallmark of a tech as opposed to a defense company. I don't think you'll see traditional defense companies having product people or chief product officer. So their role really is to say, okay, here is the roadmap for the rollout of the actual products. And inside of those products, you have the technology, and then it's the job of the CTO to then just get the technology across the line to embed into the products that the CPO deems appropriate for the marketing consultation with the customers, with the sales team. So arguably the most important thing is shaping of the products, because that then back solves for what technology do you need to design to sell those products. So a lot of engineers are almost starting the other way. It's like, well, this is kind of cool, shiny technology. And then it's like, okay, how do we sell it? It's like, no. Like you start with what products you need to get to the customer. And then you kind of try to figure out what is the technology that enables you to do so. And you can really see how, like you said, Sandy, we're not very mature in Australia to do so. I found it much easier to build out the engineering team than to build out the product team.
Right.
And in fact, for our most senior product guy, we had to import somebody of 20 years product experience from California because they just doesn't exist here. Look, I think there are success stories, obviously, not just Canva and Atlassian, but you have Cochlear, you have ResMed. I actually think medical devices are a great analogy to what we do, because say if you're making a heart pacemaker, you kind of have it not working 10% of the time. So you have that reliability expectation. So that's a great thing compared to kind of, move fast and break things mentality, which can be helpful, but on a battlefield when you need reliability, it's a bit more difficult. I mean, if your Windows system goes down, it's frustrating, but if something you're relying with your life on goes down, it's a bit more of a problem. But at the same time, it's very important to also have fast cadence, which is sometimes missing in the medical device industry because it's obviously super regulated.
Yeah.
So you kind of want the cadence of the tech, but at the same time, precision of the medical devices industry. But yeah, I mean, it's funny. I think from day one, the fact that we said, look, we're not going to sell much in Australia. Like no Australian defense company that's successful can really be, I think, relying on the Australian market. Even though we are 12th largest defense spend in the world, most of the money goes towards very large, expensive platforms like submarines and jet fighters. So there's actually not that much at all left over once you account for those. And so as a result, we said we're going to be an export business. And so because of that, we are competing on the global stage, and you're benchmarking yourselves against people that think in terms of product terms, and you're kind of like, well, what are we missing? For example, the reason why we developed as slick of marketing as we have is because we never compete against Australian companies, and Australians are terrible at marketing, generally speaking. We always competed against American companies who are amazing at marketing. It's kind of funny, like you're looking at a lot of Australian businesses across the board, and you're like, well, the tech and products are really good, but terrible marketing. You look at some American companies, and you're like, amazing marketing, products not so good, but amazing marketing.
And the latter one tends to win out just by sheer force of will and money.
And so a part of it, I guess, also is really close collaboration with your customers, like almost co-developing, which relates back to your comment earlier about engineers cooking up, the gold-plated version, but doesn't necessarily relate to the real world.
Yeah, so we have now deployments in about 50 countries around the world, and we have trusted relationships with a number of tier one end customers. And so most of these customers have very strong ideas of what the future looks like. And they would normally give that feedback to the salespeople, to field engineers, which are there to help deploy the systems. And that flows into the product team. And then the product team basically triangulates between all the different feedback. And usually the rule of thumb is if you have, say, US and UK and maybe French and some other militaries say you need this feature, it's like, okay, I guess we'll prioritize it. And so you kind of change. I mean, we update roadmap all the time. It's not like entire 180 turnaround, but there's fine tuning almost weekly in terms of response to especially software-based developments, not so much hardware, because you need quarterly software cycles. And, within the quarterly software cycles, you have weekly goals and monthly goals. And then you kind of push it out every quarter to customers. And then we have artificial intelligence engine that will be releasing our third generation engine next year that we're super excited about, which will learn fully in real time. So there's no lag at all. You just basically have to maintain it. So all of that is super exciting for us. But yeah, ultimately it links to feedback from customers.
You've got some massive scaling of production that you want to orchestrate over the next year or so. What are your big challenges there, and what are some of the concerns about how in Australia and the US and Europe as well?
We're planning to move from $500 million a year in current production capacity to $2.4 billion, so almost five times increase. It's quite a lot by end of next year. So, that's 12 months time frame. That's being done in three limbs. So expansion in Australia. So in Australia and also globally, the way we work is because we're trying to minimize the capex invested and also speed up the process. So we have a supply chain that's underneath us. So there are about 50 companies. A lot of them are little Australian companies, like say from Central Coast or from Adelaide that grew with us as we grew. And we usually try to have 2 or 3 suppliers for every part. Like something like RF Patrol would have about 200 line items in its bill of materials. So basically it's baking recipe. And by percentage of local content, it's about 85% Australian, about 15% US. So everything we can do in Australia, we get done here. Say every part that we can, we do 2 or 3 supplies, and we regularly feed all of 2 or 3 to make sure that they're ready to supply us when needed. And we are then doing final assembly ourselves, as well as we have 2 contract manufacturers, one in Sydney and one in Adelaide, that work with us. And we're doing expansion of our own assembly space by about 8-fold. So we're moving from our existing headquarters where assembly is done on the first floor to a dedicated facility elsewhere just for the production. And that will be fully online by around January. And then our contract manufacturers are expanding, our supply chain is expanding, but then importantly, at the same time, we're spinning up in Europe. So we started working with a contract manufacturer, and then Europeans now are rolling out a lot of local initiatives that require 65% local content, like the 800 billion euro rearm Euro plan or defense
Is that a
readiness plan.
direct result of the NATO reset?
Yeah. Everybody's trying to be self-sufficient in terms of the domestic industry capacity. So we turn to contract manufacturing in Europe for a number of reasons. One is sort of similar to what we do here. Contract manufacturing enables you really rapid and low capex startup because you're not having to fit out a facility, hire employees, but also critically, you can talk, and they're usually people that develop that build hardware for big defense manufacturers and so on. So they're already pretty experienced in this kind of thing. And they would have their own Rolodex of their local supply chain. So you basically sit down with a blueprint of your product and you basically say, right, what can you do locally? And they're like, well, there's Bob down the street. He can do the plastics and, whatever. So with that, you can very quickly get to the 65% local content. And then you still import some things out of Australia, out of the US, and then they put everything together. That meets the requirements. So that'll be all up and running in the first quarter of 26, we believe. And then we're also doing the US, again, same thing, sort of assembly, final assembly type situation, where that'll be probably up and running by mid-26. And altogether, it will come to about 2.4 billion capacity by end of the year.
I mean, that's incredible. And also, I love the supply chain stuff. Like, in Australia, we sort of convince ourselves of a certain narrative is like, well, we've got to get into global supply chains. We've actually got to build one locally. The mistake that people make is they may not have a particular skill for counter drone tech, but they do have adjacent skills. And what you've actually got to do is you've got to find those adjacent skills. And what I've heard over and over is you can build local supply chain skills here, right?
Yeah, beginning is the hardest because you're still trying to figure out what you need, and also companies don't really know about you. And there are many ways to do it. So there are trade industry associations that a lot of these manufacturers belong to. So you kind of go into almost like a manufacturer trade association, and you're like, right, we're looking for A, B, and C. Who are capability providers that you have? So I'd encourage any supplier to be part of as many associations as possible, because then they basically promote their members to people like us. And then as we became more well-known, people started to contact us and they're like, hey, we have this capacity to do this or that. And then our engineering team would then go and visit them and sometimes would engage them on exactly what they're asking, or sometimes would say, well, actually, no, this doesn't fit, but you have this other thing which we're interested in. And then you just start working more and more with those guys, and they, you start with smaller batches, and then you kind of scale up. And we're always interested in hearing from more companies because it kind of makes us more resilient as well.
But I've heard this before. I've asked other manufacturers, where do you go to source talent and supply chain connections, like the industry trade shows, and it's not rocket science in that way. You've got a pool of people that are always on the hunt for new opportunities, and it's just not something that is talked about in our media nearly enough, and certainly in our business media.
Old-fashioned handshakes and conversations over really bad coffee and sort of Monte Carlo biscuits. I'm wondering, Oleg, I mean, staying at the front edge of innovation, given you've talked about being up against Chinese made drones that have functionality, that are going into the sort of civilian space that have sort of military functionality. But what are your biggest concerns with respect to staying at the leading edge of innovation?
We're actually, like you said, Joe, we're less concerned about our counter-drone competitors, as we're pretty comfortable that we can stay in front of them, and more trying to make sure that we are up to date with what the Chinese and the Russians are doing. Now, the good thing is we actually want them to innovate, because the moment drone manufacturers stop innovation, the whole counter-drone industry commoditizes, our gross margins collapse. And so we want them to innovate, because that's what's keeping us in business, and I'm sure they will. There's no real step change where I don't believe there'll be something the Chinese will dream up tomorrow about, and that will just kill our business. Rather, instead, what we're seeing is incrementally more difficult drones to detect and defeat. And that's kind of what we are spending more and more time chasing. Now, the good thing is that you could be Chinese, but physics is still physics. The laws of physics still apply to you, and there's only in so many places you can hide from us. And I think also this game is becoming more and more software enabled. So they're investing more and more into softwares that kind of hitting the limits of hardware, and so do we. And our customers, importantly, don't expect us to be 100%. So we give a fence analogy. So you can climb over fences, you can cut holes in fences, but people still do fences because it keeps the other side out, at least to the best extent possible. So what we say to customers is that we are the best in the game, and we continue to innovate faster than anybody else would, which is what's keeping and customers understand that nothing is 100%, right? So I think I sometimes get investors who come to us and they're like, well, what about drone that does this or this or this? And it's like, well, you don't need to be perfect, but you just need to keep getting better all the time.
You've said that so counter drone tech, a lot of it's about the data. Can you help us visualize how that data comes in and how it's used and how it's applied in order to keep innovating and keep defending against the swarm of drones and drone types?
So when it comes to drone signal software and AI, about 5 years ago, we realized that we can't keep doing a manual fingerprint, call it like fingerprints in radio frequency space, library-based approach, because there were unlimited permutations of drone signals coming out. It's actually very similar to what militaries found 30 years ago, because back then, if you are operating a frigate, the way radar works is by bouncing energy out and then basically detecting what comes back, and that's how they track targets. And back 30 years ago, there used to be essentially only two modes of military radars operating, being the peacetime mode, which is what the radar would normally do, and then if war breaks out, it changes the way the radar appears, and that's kind of the wartime mode. And back then, the libraries used to basically say, okay, well, if I can find out what this frigate's peacetime signature is, which is easy enough because you just record it as the thing passes by you. But then if you get access to the wartime signature, then you can basically detect that frigate in any situation. But then as the software changed, the radars learned, or the radars became able to do unlimited amount of signatures. So then you're like, okay, well, just having access to 5, 10, 20 signatures is irrelevant because it comes up with an entirely random signature every time it operates. So drones kind of became almost the same in that what used to be 5 or 10 very basic radio frequency signatures now became like an unlimited amount of signatures. So when you're detecting a drone, like if you're out there, you're kind of like, okay, chances are pretty high that whatever drone is coming at me, it will look nothing like anything I've seen before. So with that, you need AI as a mechanism to detect drones. But the thing with AI, the complexity is not so much about the algorithms, but about the data. So you need a very large body of clean, well-tagged, well-maintained data. So first you need to go global because they all sound a bit different, the drones in different environments. So we started collecting drone signals in different environments in Japan, Europe, Ukraine, South America, US, Australia, and other places. I mean, thank God we weren't like actively
And you do that in the field, right? That's that. Right.
You can't really do synthetic or simulate. I mean, we do all of that too, but really good data, you need to do old-fashioned way. It sounds a bit archaic, but you really need to record the data. You need to have humans then reviewing the data, tagging it, checking for things. Because if you're trying to do fully kind of computerized approach, you'll end up with rubbish.
Right.
Not right.
There's a lesson there.
So we have several teams of basically data engineers who are, data annotators who are adding that human element to what the machines do already. So with that, we obviously now have also a large amount of devices always in the field. They collect additional data plus through our own testing. And so as a result, that set of AI engines always gets better and better as they as they receive more information. So today we basically keep collecting that information. Every quarter the engine learns from that, and then the next generation of the better engine comes out. And then, like I was saying earlier, there's a generational leap next year where there's an engine that'll be able to basically, instead of sending the data to us, we are creating the learning opportunity, and then the engine gets pushed back every quarter. The engine will fully learn right in the device in real time. We still will want to receive the data to basically monitor and just make sure that we keep an eye on the process, but it'll be kind of fully learning within seconds in real time of the new things it sees that it never seen before. And also, of course, by centralizing it from our side, say, for example, the engine might optimize from environment in Ukraine, but it doesn't know what's going on in terms of the latest developments in Japan. So us centralizing it back and still pushing it out every quarter, you incorporate learning from all other parts of the world as well. So when it comes to Ukraine, though, so it's a very fast moving environment. So I would say that most of the innovation is actually in the drones themselves, not in the counter drone over there, because drones, I would say, even though the two are very closely connected, drones as the industry are very Lego-like. So you basically have your pieces. So you have your flying chassis, you have your blades, the camera, the sense and avoid system, the comms module, and you can kind of put it all together, and then you experiment with what comes out. And both the Russians and Ukrainians have been doing this really well. For counter drone, I would almost say it's more similar to pharmaceutical R&D in that you need to have large teams of engineers working together over large amounts of time, marshalling forward the development. The mentality is also very different. So when you're creating a drone, you're basically saying, okay, I just gonna hack my way through whatever gets through the perimeter of the facility. When you are on the defense side, your mentality is that, like, how do I absolutely make sure that nothing gets through? So you have to be, so you're kind of less chaotic and a lot more systematic about how you design your products. And so I think what they say, I had this Australian Army brigadier tell me once that the classic kind of the Army doctrine is that when you're attacking, like, you expect to probably lose in certain cases, like, say, airplane attacks. Like, if you think of World War II, you might lose 90% of your force, but you'll still be successful with remaining 10. When you're on the defensive side, the moment you lost 20%, you're done. Like, the other side will get through. So it's really important to have a very different mentality when you're on the defensive side. Then we're finding that Ukraine is also where the rest of the world is learning its techniques. So like an anecdotal evidence we find is that in Latin America, where we are providing our equipment to government agencies for fighting the narcos, the anecdote is that you have both Colombian and Mexican gangs send their members for work experience on both sides of the Ukraine conflict, so enrolling into both Ukrainian and Russian military. Wow. And then they kind of learn the techniques, and then they come back and basically embed the learnings, the best and the latest into the local warfare in Latin America. It's pretty insane.
That's extraordinary. Could you talk, Oleg, a little bit about Project Land 156, because you're now working with the ADF, this sort of much more rapid attempt to increase capability within the ADF. Does it relate back to AUKUS and your role there?
So Land 156 is the rollout of counter-drone systems across Australian defence and also overseas bases. The project went through phase 1, which is acquisitions of trial quantities of mostly dismounted, so handheld, but also on vehicle systems. And we have been a meaningful recipient of that. So we got about 6 million out of, I think the total is something like $30 million spent across a whole bunch of global suppliers, but these are just initial trial acquisitions. There's going to be a lot more. Then the government appointed a system integration partner, or SIP, in Leidos Australia. So essentially it's in a program administrator role. So Leidos Australia expertise is, they're not so much a counter-drone expert. They, in fact, have no experience in that, to my knowledge, in Australia. But their core experience in running large programs for Australian government. So, for example, they do stuff for Air Service Australia in Australian airports, in completely other areas. And so their role would be essentially administrator, advisor to Australian Defence Force to do acquisitions. And so we're waiting on the start of those planned acquisitions, which should commence in hopefully sometime early 26. And this would be probably initially trial quantities of different gear for around bases, around vehicles, and we believe we're pretty well positioned for that. In some cases in the past, like for example for Air 6500, which is essentially a missile protection system for Australia, the government chosen to have the same party as the administrator as well as the supplier, being Lockheed Martin in that case. But here they've decided, and I think it makes I think it makes sense to have different parties, because there would obviously be conflict of interest if we would be program administrator and then would assign contracts to ourselves, which is I think what the government was seeking to avoid when they appointed Leidos as the SIP. On AUKUS, I think this is a little different to AUKUS. So LAN 156 is a standalone program. Australian Defence Capability Minister Pat Conroy said it's going to be a $1.3 billion program over the next 10 years. And we hope that it's going to be front-ended, given it's a pretty urgent requirement.
Yeah.
AUKUS obviously is first and foremost about the nuclear-powered submarines, and you guys have been all tracking that in the news, and also a degree of ITAR information sharing, which I think we're still seeing how all that is going to play out. We are not really involved in it as much. So I guess we went through administrative steps there. But at the same time, if you're ITAR contaminated, which is the legal term when you are getting your ITAR kit into your programs, it means that you have significantly high administrative burden inside of your Australian facility in terms of your export processes. So our current approach is to treat all the ITAR stuff in our US office, where we have a small R&D team who can deal with all of that, and then keep Sydney office ITAR free.
Uncontaminated, so to speak.
Okay. Yeah, the contamination is a choice word, isn't it? So speaking of acquisitions, you got some cash, and I think you're looking to go shopping in the next year or so, like an M&A strategy, right? Is that right? What is the primary impetus for M&A?
Acquisition of tech that is additive to what we have will be the primary driver. I don't have a desperate need for it, meaning if we just continue organic growth for foreseeable future, that'll be totally fine as a business. There are no competitors that are of interest to us to acquire. There are some technologies, like, for example, passive radars, that I'm curious about. So the difference between traditional radar, like an active radar, which works by balancing energy out and getting different reflections and then recording it back and tracking objects, and passive radar. So passive radar uses background illumination from things like terrestrial networks, cell phone towers, and how that interacts with flying objects. So you are tracking objects without giving away your location, which is what an active radar would do, which is important when you have Russians or the Chinese on the other side, because anything that emits will attract their attention and potential artillery strike in your direction. So the issue today is that that's a very, very nascent technology. Obviously, it doesn't work well in situations without good background illumination. So if you are in a sort of a very rural area without degree of signal pollution around you, then it's just not going to work, because there's not a lot of background energy to bounce around the objects. And also just generally, it's very early stage. So we are patiently waiting for the technology to pick up, and then we might look of kind of getting in, and whether it's organically or via an acquisition. But I think, honestly saying, the reason why I'm sitting on a big pile of cash, and we are like, it's not guidance, but we are anticipating to be profitable and cash flow positive going forward. That's our goal. Just like some people that might have starved in their lives, you hear reports of them basically always having hordes of food around the house. Because we starved of cash for so long as a business, I just kind of feel psychological safety in having cash, even if I don't have immediate need for it.
Under those mattresses, so to speak.
That's right.
No, but that's thanks for clarifying that because some of the things I've read, it felt to me, or I read it as this was going to be a big driver, and you're saying not necessarily. You'll be very, 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 very choice about that,
Mhm.
right?
I
Um,
think there are lots of acquisitions where you're actually creating better opportunity for the target than for yourself, and then it's just a massive management distraction. So
Yeah.
you really don't want to screw it up.
I,
What
I'm
about
cur-
talent acquisition? I mean, we've talked about like
Mm.
it's the CTO and this chief product officer, and with the other facilities like in the US and Europe. Is talent acquisition hard, or are you finding that Drone Shield is in fact where that talent wants to go? Is it a constant uphill battle to get the right people, or are you actually fairly comfortable with the pool of talent that's out there and your ability to get it?
It's probably halfway in between. So
Right.
we're 400 people today, up from
Yeah.
250 at the end of last year. We got about 100 open roles that we are advertising, mostly in Sydney, but also in the US and Europe. Um, we have now our in-house recruitment team, which is growing. I think it's about 4 people now. We use
Well, okay.
agencies extensively. We use executive recruitment firms for some high-end roles, which are more difficult to hire. So it really depends on the role. And I mean, there are some very, very narrow specialized roles we're looking for. And for that, you kind of
Mm,
need it's a couple of things. One is you want somebody who knows who are good people, and then when you talk to somebody,
yeah.
obviously a good recruiter will know reputation
Mhm.
of
Mm,
individuals,
yeah.
and as opposed to kind of people who are career hoppers that don't really achieve objectives in the places where
Mhm.
they
Mhm. Mhm.
uh, previously been. And also our goal is as we scale up is to continue increasing the average quality of employees. I think there are a lot of companies that sacrifice quality just to bulk up,
Mhm.
and we want to make sure that every new person is much better than the existing stuff, and that is making it more difficult.
Wow. Well, that's a challenging objective. Can you talk a little bit about the capital plans um, of Drone Shield? You've had, this pretty interesting experience on the ASX. You've recently joined the ASX 200. Last year was a bit of a rough ride. You had to have a trading halt after one story that was published said raising questions about the share price. So what's that been like, and what do you think the future of the company is on the ASX? Is that where you're going to stay? Do you see listing elsewhere as a possibility?
So I think when we're at the current size, ASX is great
Yeah.
because it means that you have high position inside the indices. I was actually looking at this the other day. I was participating in the ASX seminar, and they were saying that uh, if you want to be an S&P 500, I could be getting my numbers wrong, but you need to have something like 20 billion US market cap, which is pretty insane if you compare it to ASX sort of index inclusion, right? Like you can be on the I think it's something like US 1 billion to qualify for
Mhm.
ASX 200. I could be
Mhm.
slightly off. So if you say go to NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange, I think at our current market cap, you just get lost in the noise of
Yeah.
the micro
Mhm.
caps. I mean, yes, you might get some more exposure from US retail. You might get some more from the US only funds, but a number of our shareholders, and for example, Fidelity came into our register, and I
Mhm.
think
Yeah.
right now there might be something like maybe 7 or 8% of our
Mhm.
register is our largest holder. They're Boston based, and they have
Mhm.
mandate to invest in ASX listed securities. So there's no issue. I mean, especially if you are
Mhm.
a pretty specialist company. So
Mhm.
at the start of this, we're talking about how we're the only counter drone public listed company in the world. Um, well, it doesn't really matter where you are. People,
Mhm.
I think, will look to invest in you if that's the exposure that they're looking for. And ASX is pretty well regarded. So no, look, there might be eventually plan if we are say 3 times our current size, and it could make sense. But right now, it just doesn't really seem to. And we have a small army of about 35,000, mostly Australian, but also German and American retail shareholders. And
Uh-huh.
if you try to do secondary listing, especially, or even change the listing, you don't know how much of liquidity you're gonna
Yeah.
sacrifice in the process.
Yeah.
So yeah, no plans to change listing at this point.
I just wanted to have a follow-up about, your institutional investor support. Regal's Phil King was an early supporter, and I mean, you really helped him redeem his reputation this year. DroneShield had been on an amazing ride this year. So how do you feel about the institutional interest in the stock? And
Yeah. So do you feel like the meme stock period is sort of phasing into something different?
So I think a lot of the volatility last year was due to the very high retail nature of our register.
Mm,
I'm
mm,
loosely guessing, and I haven't done register analysis recently, that last year were probably something like maybe over 90% retail. Now, I'd say institutions are probably more like, again, I'm speculating, but maybe something like 30% of our registers, so
mhm,
significantly
mhm, yeah,
more than sub 10%.
mm,
And I think a stock should really be more like 50-60%
mm,
institutionally owned,
mm,
given the government nature of our customers
mm,
and so forth. And I think institutions tend to be probably a bit less inertia focused in a way how some retail investors are. So the great thing about our size now is that we're becoming liquid enough and large enough to be relevant and on the radar for some of the overseas fund managers, while in the
mm,
past we were just too illiquid for them to get out of this
Yeah.
what they wanted.
mm,
Yep.
So that is really helping. So, for example, when I was at DSCI, which is the largest defense industry show in the world in London about a month and a half ago, afterwards I stayed for a little bit, and I basically had my entire week filled with UK London-based fund managers. And
mhm,
if I
Okay.
had a month, I probably could have done a whole month of meetings.
mm,
Yep.
And you're getting immense amount of interest, and the kind of people you meet with, like a year ago, would have been too small, too liquid for them. So my
mm,
goal now is to try to attract as much of their interest as
mm,
possible.
mhm,
I do want to go back to like the Russian Ukraine war has been extraordinary in so many ways, but also in really manifesting a changed nature of warfare. But I'm also just really interested in what it meant to you and Drone Shield. Do you remember where you were and what you first thought at the outbreak when Russia invaded Ukraine?
I'm trying to think what I was doing. I mean, it was pretty shocking, but at the same time, it kind of seemed like as sad as it is, a continuation of what happened in 2014 when
Yeah,
mm,
Russians
yeah,
in went into Crimea. So it wasn't completely shocking. So I think at the time you're kind of thinking, well, how's that going to work out? Is it going to be kind of what Russians expect, just a week and you're done, sort of thing? Is it
yeah,
going to be something else? And obviously, we've seen regime change, well, for the better, I guess you can say, in Ukraine in the past, from the pro-Russian to the current, and also failed change in Belarus. So there's kind of quite a bit of volatility in the region as well. So yeah, it's been a shock for sure, and you kind of just say, all right, well, what can we do? How can we be helpful to this? And obviously, then we started seeing immediate shipment of our kit to Ukraine, and
I
and
was going to
further.
say it's also a tragic opportunity, right? But it's an opportunity. Just really interested in sort of what the energy and the sort of accelerate how it accelerated the drone shield action, if you like.
Well, in the positive, I guess, in terms of silver lining, is that it really adds the mission to the business,
mm,
and I think it really kind of underscored
Yeah,
for a lot of employees. Well, this is what I'm doing.
yeah,
Okay, I'm here to
yeah,
maximize shareholder value. I mean, we all are, but there's more to it too, in that you are trying to save people's lives. And I mean, of course, we do this in other customer settings as well, but this was kind of the most prominent. And then you start, and this took obviously a while to start filtering through. You kind of hear stories about how a customer would contact us and they're like, I really need software update as soon as possible. This product has saved my life three
mhm,
times.
right.
And to me honestly, it's actually not what I see in the news that moves me like emotionally personally, but personal stories like that,
yeah,
that
Yes.
kind of, because that's kind of a lot more visceral.
mm. And for your team, having that sort of purpose is incredible incentive to stay on top of the challenges. I'm really curious about what the Russian maths education system and growing up, having had that, being a brilliant math student, and how that came about, and then what happened when you left Russia.
In essence, Russian education system, or it was at least back then, I don't know what exactly it's now. I doubt it changed a lot. Is quite different to the Western systems in that your goal is to have the very best performance you can out of your top 1%, as opposed to kind of bring the bottom up to the average as much as possible, and to have a more balanced society, which is what a lot of the Western educational systems are about. I think the most irony is. Russians also have a word called special needs, except the Russians define elite as special needs, while Westerners define, while the Westerners define obviously below the. Well, you guys would know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
That is so interesting.
Yeah, it's just as much focus on special needs in both countries, except obviously meaning opposite things.
Yeah.
And so I was fortunate enough to be in one of those, and I mean, at the time it was painful. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, you feel proud to be part of it, but it's remarkably difficult. You kind of have no life. This is kind of, I mean, it's almost like training for Olympics in many ways. And also culture, I think, is a bit different. While, say, like for example, in Australia, there's obviously a very strong focus on sporting prowess and
Yeah, and
fitness,
math is optional.
or STEM, maybe more broadly
STEM.
speaking. And I think it's almost the opposite in the kind of school system that I grew up with. I'm not saying there's like a right or wrong way of doing things. I find that, like for example, another important point of difference is that, and again, no right or wrong. I think that probably the right is somewhere in the middle between the two, where the Western system is kind of like everybody gets a prize and everybody's important. Let's promote self-esteem.
Yep.
The Russian system is pure intimidation and fear. Where the concept of bullying is like bullying is encouraged if you're a teacher.
Yes, character building. I mean,
We see that in the leadership. How would you change Australia's maths system, education system? Because without more highly skilled mathematicians, we're really, going to struggle to maintain any sort of leadership or even just keeping up with everyone else.
I don't really know. I don't think there's a simple solution. I mean, so I grew up in New Zealand after Russia, and I think New Zealand has much more of a tall poppy syndrome than Australia does. I remember I was in a Catholic boys-only school in New Zealand, in Christchurch, which happened to be just a good school, which is why I enrolled there. And I mean, you have to be a member of some kind of a sports club. It's compulsory, and the closest I could pick to my interest was member of the chess club. And the amount of abuse I copped over that was significant. So I don't think there's a simple thing. If something is celebrated, if something is seen as to look forward to, then obviously it's going to be seen as role models.
Yeah.
So kind of how do you create role models so then students look up to that, and they're kind of like, well, this is what I want to do. How do you have parents to encourage people to kind of go in that direction? I don't think there are simple solutions. I think if there were, it would be implemented already.
Yeah, right. And your mother was encouraging you?
Yeah, no, for sure. So, well, I mean, in the sense that I think it's like one of these. Her approach was always kind of like a gentle one, in that your parent kind of tells you not lies, but the parent tells you, oh, you're good at something. And then if they say something enough times, you kind of start to believe it yourself. And then you're like, oh, I'm good at this. So, and then you just start doing more of that. And maybe eventually you become good at it, even if probably that was not true to start with.
So it is true.
Interesting. That's interesting. And because, so in other words, that was that encouragement that she gave you, but you were otherwise really self-directed.
Yeah, I mean, eventually you internalize it. So I think with a lot of influences in life, you maybe it starts external and then eventually becomes an internal thing.
To finish off, are you having fun in the role? Because you've had so many phases and shifts and challenges, from the taking over CEO and the removal of the science founders, and it constantly running, and you're building this. Are you really enjoying where it's at? Or is it just too much going on to? Love it.
Type 2 enjoyment. So you know how they say type 1 is when you're like having a chocolate bar and type 2 is when you're climbing a mountain? This is like type 2 enjoyment.
Thank you very much, Oleg. It's been a really fascinating conversation. We really appreciate how open you've been, and all the best for what happens next.
Okay.
Great to
Thank
speak.
you.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye.